Good morning. Welcome to the Innosight webinar on creating breakthrough customer solutions using jobs to be done. Please hold tight for just a minute or two as other audience members get a chance to tune in, and then we'll start.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Webinars Made Easy. Welcome to the webinar. You have entered as an organizer and may now speak to any other organizers or panelists on the line. When you are ready to begin the presentation, press the Start Broadcast button on the GoToWebinar control panel to allow all attendees to hear you. This system will notify you once you begin your broadcast.
Putting the customer at the center of everything they do. But since Amazon's success is so well known, why doesn't every company simply
copy that approach? I'm pleased to introduce our presenters today, Kevin Boland and Robin Bolton, who are here in our Boston headquarters. They will explore a framework studied by Bezos and other corporate leaders known as jobs to be done, which is a method for understanding the often hidden emotional, social, and functional needs that customers are trying to fulfill in their daily lives. The jobs framework was pioneered by Innosight co-founder and Harvard Business School professor Clay Christensen in his 2003 book, The Innovative Solution. It's safe to say that Innosight has more experience with jobs to be done than any other firm in the world. I will introduce our presenters. Kevin Boland is a partner at Innosight where he collaborates with leaders of organizations seeking to create new growth opportunities. Prior to joining Innosight in 2007, Kevin served as the Chief Marketing Officer at Lionsbridge, a global technology services company. Kevin began his career with IBM Global Services, spending 6 years in a variety of strategic planning, marketing, and consulting roles. Robin Bolton is also a partner at Innosight, where she works with senior-level executives to help them define and build new multi-million-dollar businesses. Robin spent 5 years in brand management at Procter & Gamble, where she led the North American launch of Swiffer. We want to hear from you, so we'll be taking a couple breaks to answer questions. Feel free to put your personal perspective or company perspective into your question. Just type your question into the dialog box located on the control panel in the upper right corner of your screen. No need to click or raise your hand. I'll be collecting the questions and posing them to Kevin and Robin. And so now I turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you everybody for taking the time out of your busy day to listen to Robin and I describe something that we found to be a very compelling component of Innosight's work and also its impact on our clients over the last many years. As just to show you about a little bit about Innosight, Innosight was founded by Clayton Christensen in 2000, right in the middle of his publishing of The Innovator's Dilemma and The Innovator's Solution, where he was detailing out how new growth initiatives tend to struggle within large enterprises, and then how large enterprises can capitalize on those opportunities to move past any disruptions in their marketplace. Innosight's work really focuses on 3 primary areas. These are strategy, capabilities, and acceleration. And we're going to talk a little bit more later today about how the jobs to be done methodology and approach to capturing customer insights influences our work in all 3 of these critical component areas. Our agenda for today, we wanted to start with a brief introduction as to what jobs to be done are. There's a variety of different competing methodologies and frameworks out there that you may have heard of, and we thought it would be good to just kind of level set everyone in terms of the definitions that we use and how we see it applied within the marketplace. We'll talk a little bit about why they are a powerful business tool and how they can influence a variety of different decision-making options for you personally as well as within your enterprise. We'll talk tactically about how to discover them and share some techniques we've used in the field to help surface jobs to be done based insights and how to apply them in your different development opportunities. And then as Evan mentioned, we'll have some Q&A time at the end, but also please feel free to share your questions throughout and we'll pause to respond. So with that cadence in mind of us talking and you sharing, we wanted to open first with just a quick question to understand a bit more about who's on the line and how your organization is really focused on developing new ideas. So we'd like to put up a poll question now, which you'll be able to respond to in just a moment. And we'd like you to select, where do most of your organization's new ideas come from? Are they derived from direct customer insights? Do they come from some internal R&D or other development-oriented kind of a team of deep thinkers who brainstorm these ideas themselves? Is there a single visionary leader or team of senior leaders that perhaps feel they have the keys to all new growth initiatives? Do you copy competitor moves and simply try and keep pace in the marketplace? Or do you feel you're in an organization that frankly doesn't have new ideas? It's a challenge, but we recognize it's one that many organizations do find themselves in that state. So with that, we'll put up a polling question and allow you to respond. Okay. So we'll just close the poll now. And in terms of results, we're seeing a pretty diversified group, which is not unexpected given a call of this breadth. It's nice to see that a decent number of you do believe you have a direct path into customer insights, and hopefully today's discussion will help you refine and perhaps expand your purview into those customer insights. Those of you using an internal R&D or other team may wish to think about how you can also train that organization, if it's not one that you're a part of directly, to start to think about incorporating customer insights more into their inspiration and help channel their creative energies into more specific customer needs. For those of you dependent on a single visionary or other senior leader, the Jobs to Be Done opportunity can help you perhaps offer a response to some of their inspired ideas and help vet those various ideas in the marketplace quickly in response to what customers are going to show most demand for. Good to see very few of you are copying competitor moves, as often the competitors are also looking to what you're doing, so you end up in a very vicious cycle of chasing each other's features. And then not having new ideas is also very encouraging. I would assume that people who have spent time with Innosight and know a bit about our environment are not facing those kind of circumstances, but it's good to just test that here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Robin Bolton, who is going to take you through a general overview of what Jobs to Be Done are.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. So let's just start at the beginning, at kind of the most fundamental question, which is, what actually is a job to be done? You've heard that term, dozens of times already in this webinar, but it will be good to start with a common definition and a common understanding. So at its simplest level, a job to be done really is a problem that someone is trying to solve in a particular circumstance. And a lot of times we get the question, why is it called a job? Why isn't it called a need or some of those other terms? And the way we think about it, the way Clay Christensen posed it when he coined the phrase, is that people don't buy products and services, they hire them. So just as people are hired to do jobs and roles within a company, products, services, etc., are hired to solve a problem. They're hired to do a job to be done. So the classic example of the power of really understanding what the job to be done is and really understanding how it is a problem and how to phrase it is actually taken from HBS marketing professor Ted Levitt, when he said, if you think about a drill, people don't actually want to buy a drill. What they want is a 1/4 inch hole. And there are certainly lots of ways that you could get a 1/4 inch hole in a wall, but probably the best way is a drill. And so really understanding the job to be done of a customer and that their job is around a hole, not a drill, can really help you understand what the opportunities are in the marketplace. So with that definition, let's just kind of start with a thought question, which is, what would you pack if we gave you an around the world ticket? So just take a moment to think about what you would put in that suitcase if suddenly somebody were to walk into your office or wherever you are right now and hand you a ticket for a trip around the world. So with your suitcase packed in mind, now ask yourself why you would pack those things. Why did you choose the things that you did to put into that suitcase? The why, the answer there, is your job to be done. And so that's, as we talk about later in this webinar, how do you identify jobs to be done? It really all does center around the why a customer would want to or would actually do something. The why helps you get to that problem that drives behavior. So now there are 3 different types of jobs to be done. And it's really important to keep all 3 of these in mind, but also to search out all 3 of these. So there are functional jobs to be done. So if you're thinking about packing your suitcase for an around-the-world trip and that there's a chance you'll either go somewhere very cold like Antarctica or you'll be somewhere perhaps in winter, you probably threw something warm into that suitcase. And so you had a functional job around keeping warm when you're in a cold setting. And that cold setting is the circumstance in which that job has occurred. There are emotional jobs to be done. And these are about how you want to feel in a certain circumstance. And so again, as you were thinking about packing that suitcase for your around-the-world trip, you probably wanted to feel confident in certain settings. So maybe you packed a nice change of clothes. Maybe you packed a blazer or a nice dress if you thought you were going to go out to a nice restaurant while you're on your trip. It really was about choosing things that will give you a certain feeling, in this case, confidence. And then finally, the 3rd type of job are social jobs. And this is really around how you want to portray yourself to others and how you want others to perceive you. So as you were thinking about traveling around the world, you probably figured, you may end up in some places where the culture is extremely different from your home culture. And there may be social norms and certain things that are accepted or not accepted. So perhaps you threw some pieces of clothing in your suitcase to really help you be accepted when you visit a new place, to make sure that you fit in and you were seen as acceptable within that culture. And as we talk about again later in this webinar, you're going to want to, as you talk to people, really try to tease out all 3 of these different types of jobs. Because even though often what you hear first is functional, what really drives people's behavior are the emotional and social jobs. And understanding those can really unlock the true opportunities that are out there in the marketplace and for your business. So while there are 3 different types of jobs to be done, not all jobs are created equal. Some jobs are more important than others. So if you were leaving on a trip today, you may have jobs around packing a suitcase that are way more important than other jobs around maybe getting your car serviced. So that's why circumstances are so important in your understanding of jobs, is because a circumstance can really drive how important a job is at a specific moment. You want to also look for jobs that are unsatisfied, because if a job is unsatisfied, there's a pain point in the consumer's mindset, and they're actively looking for a solution. So you don't have to go through the extreme effort of convincing somebody that they need your solution. They're already looking for it. And you want to find frequent jobs. So admittedly, you probably don't every day have someone coming into your office offering you an around-the-world ticket. But if you're going to be on the road for, say, 80 days, or you're going to be on the road for a long time, you're going to have frequent jobs around what's in that suitcase, around the clothes, making sure they're not wrinkled, making sure they're clean, etc. So as you look at jobs, you want to find not only the functional, emotional, and social ones, but you really want to hone in on the jobs that are important, unsatisfied, and frequent, because those are the jobs that define the key pain points in your customer's mind. Now, when you combine all of those, functional, emotional, social jobs that are important, unsatisfied, and frequent, that's when you find the opportunity. And so as we continue to talk through in the rest of this webinar about how jobs can be used, about how you can find jobs, you always want to keep in mind that a job is a job and it's very useful. And oftentimes when we do this type of research, we'll find hundreds of jobs. But you really want to focus in on the connection of these different types because that will point you to the opportunity in the marketplace and the opportunity for impact. So with that, I will hand it over to Kevin.
Just want to check before we move on. Evan, any questions that we have from the group?
We do have a question on the terminology. Someone is asking, are jobs to be done just another way of saying unmet need?
It's a great question, and one that we hear often. The way I would distinguish jobs to be done from needs is that needs are often very easily articulated by consumers. They will say, I need something to keep me warm, or in slightly more dangerous as you think about doing this type of work, I need something that does X. And the problem with that is that people are not very good at articulating the best solution for their needs. It's kind of the old Henry Ford quote of, I asked people what they wanted. They'd say a horse that was twice as fast and ate half as much. And so a lot of times when consumers talk about their needs, they're talking about solutions. Jobs to be done really refocuses both your focus, but also the consumer's focus on what are the problems. Because the problems, the jobs to be done, actually, we found are pretty consistent over time. I mean, you think about the job to be done of getting from point A to point B, that's been around for centuries. It's really the importance and the satisfaction of that job that changes. So jobs tend to be much more evergreen than needs do, and that's why we really talk about jobs and the problems to be solved.
That's a good point, because we just got another question. Are jobs static, or do they evolve over time? I can see how their importance might change in different circumstances, but are they fundamentally constant?
No, it's a great point. It's one that we've wrestled with in a lot of different circumstances, debating whether there is one universal jobs map for all consumers. And I think what it boils down to is you could create a somewhat definitive and all-inclusive map. The challenge is what lights up as important on that map will vary from person to person. Different stages in their life, different circumstances, as the question alludes to, will dictate that, and that's going to be an interesting transition to our next discussion on how trends influence jobs and how jobs can help to define trends from a consumer perspective or customer perspective. The reality is many jobs are fairly perpetual. Robin talked before about the drill and the hole situation. Mankind has been putting holes in things, since the dawn of the tools age. Initially, we used a pointy stick and we rubbed it with our hands, and it hurt a lot, but it was important to us to put a hole in whatever thing we were drilling, a shell or something like that. Over time, people said, it would be nice if my hands didn't hurt so much. So the job to be done of putting a hole in something was balanced with not hurt myself. And they evolved the pointy stick to be a metal bore, and then they said it would be great if it didn't take so much energy or so much time. So time became a priority. So they added a motor to the drill, and over time they took away the cord and made it a battery drill, which is what we now have, because convenience became important. As all these other components were satisfied by what was out there, we started to look for more opportunities and more jobs to solve, like convenience, like time, etc. 1,000 years from now, mankind will still be putting holes in things. I don't know if we'll be doing it on Mars or whatever, but we'll still have that need. The likelihood that we're still using the same lithium-ion drill that I have today is unclear, because other jobs will come into play. Harder materials, different environments that we need to be at, etc., and that will force new innovations, but the job itself is fairly persistent. Were there other follow-ups, or should we move on?
Let's move on. We have a number of questions coming in, and please keep them coming.
Excellent. So as we step into the next section on why jobs are a powerful business tool, we want to talk through a couple of different instances where jobs are utilized not only for consumer insights directly, but how they apply to the business decisions you might be making every day. So one is the one I alluded to just a moment ago in response to that question around explaining trends. A lot of people look at macro trends and they struggle to understand how it's going to influence their business. So you could look at things like the aging of America. You could look at the economic swings that we've gone through recently. You could look at the advances in certain technology sectors. And you start to question well, is my business going to benefit from this? Does this create opportunities for me? Or does it create a threat and a challenge to my business going forward? What you really want to do is understand how are these macro environmental shifts, circumstances in our language, going to influence the jobs to be done of your target customers. Are they most likely to become more involved in purchasing these areas because it's more critical to them given the new circumstance that they're in? Or are they going to become less interested as other issues become more pressing for them? In times of economic uncertainty, for example, people tend to start to prioritize things like feel secure in my financial position. And they might start to solve that with things like increasing their savings rate. Well, if you're a luxury goods item, well, that's going to lower their priority. Or there could be a countervailing opportunity, which is when I do choose to treat myself, it's a more special occasion, and I might choose to pick a more luxury good because I'm doing it less frequently than I used to. So how would you influence your marketing positioning, for example, to capitalize on that opportunity? So you'll see those moments of short luxury coming through in response to the economic trend. The question of defining strategy is related to those trends. If you look at it on a macro perspective, especially when it revolves around a technology advance or something that fundamentally changes the business model that you're in and gives customers a new direction to pursue, you have to step back and look at the businesses that you're in and decide how viable will these businesses be over time. An example we often use is the shift a few hundred years ago from sailing power to steam power for ships. Sailing power was the dominant transportation mode from the U.S. back to Europe for many, many decades, hundreds of years. But when steam came along, it was fairly ugly and small and couldn't make the trip across the Atlantic. But once it scaled up, it could offer something that the wind-powered ships couldn't, which was a predictable schedule of arrival, because they weren't dependent on the weather to get them across the Atlantic. So suddenly that offered a new dimension that people previously had ignored. A job to be done of predicting my arrival or scheduling my employees was long unsatisfied because there was no good answer in the age of wind. But in the age of steam, that job is suddenly available to be answered, and people started to prioritize that as a more critical economic driver of their business. And for the companies who could deliver on that promise, the steam companies, the new generation took hold. For the companies that were dependent on the wind, they could no longer compete, and the business divested. So those are critical decisions you want to look at to say the implications of these trends on my customers' jobs and what they choose to prioritize will benefit or impede my business growth going forward. The other way to think about it is internally around managing talent. We've had many of our clients express a significant boost in terms of their direct reaction to employees when they diagnose the employees' conversations in the terms of jobs to be done. So why is the employee coming to me now looking for a raise? Why are they looking to clarify their role? Why didn't they take this opportunity when we presented it to them, etc.? Starting to get under the surface of their reactions, you start to understand what some of their individual motivations would be. And that could be a very powerful tool when you're crafting an individual value proposition, either to attract a new candidate, to retain a high performer, or even to get someone to take on a position that they might not find very attractive, but the organization needs them to do. If you can connect with one or more of their functional, emotional, and social jobs to be done, you might find a more happy reason for them to take the position than simply saying you have to, which can be a much greater outcome long term. And the last one is the most obvious one, which we're talking quite a bit about and we'll spend more time on in the latter half of this discussion, which is the use of jobs to create new businesses, to see opportunities that exist in the marketplace that others have missed along the way, that remain an unspoken and unarticulated need and desire among your customers, that if you can fulfill it, will create a new growth opportunity. I'm reminded of when the Apple group launched the iPad. That evening after Steve Jobs' big fanfare, on Saturday Night Live, they did a skit in their news broadcast that said, today, Apple announced the device that does what all of their other devices already do. And it was kind of universally panned as something that no one really needed. It fitted somewhere between the laptop and the phone, but replicated a lot of those features. But what Apple had identified was there was a niche. There were opportunities and circumstances where a phone wasn't enough and a computer was too much, and they introduced the iPad and created a whole new category called tablet. Now, no focus group had sat down and told them they needed this. To Robin's point about Henry Ford, people are bad at articulating what the actual ideal answer is, but they saw a gap in usage and said, can we fill that gap with a different kind of device? And are there jobs to be done that we would optimize this device for, like media consumption and entertainment? They focused on those areas and released a product that really changed the world and face of computing for many generations to come. Robin, do you want to talk a little about how the Chotacool team came together with these jobs to be done?
Absolutely. So this is a story, as you see here, of Chotacool, which is actually a small appliance that was created by Godrej and Boyce, which is a company in India. And the situation that Godrej was facing was that they had an incredible business within more traditionally sized appliances, so refrigerators, stoves, white goods like that within the Indian market. But they were noticing that imports, especially from Korea and other parts of Asia, were really entering the Indian market at much, much lower prices, and so Godrej was losing market share. Now, they did what many companies do. They looked at research reports, they looked at industry reports, and they realized that about 80% of the population in India did not have access to a refrigerator type product. And so they saw this incredible unserved population and said, how do we tap into that? How do we use this unserved population, these non-consumers, as we at Innosight would call them, and use them as a way to grow our market share and to grow the market? And so we started working with Godrej, and our original hypothesis was, let's just create a smaller, cheaper version of a refrigerator. Kind of a typical mindset that a lot of companies have as they seek to serve the bottom of the pyramid. And as we went out into the rural villages and we talked to folks, what we realized is that their jobs to be done were very, very different than the jobs to be done that would lead somebody to want a smaller, cheaper version of a refrigerator. It wasn't about storing food for weeks. It wasn't about stockpiling food so that you have it on hand to serve your family for the next several days. The jobs to be done in the rural villages was really about keeping leftovers safe overnight or for a couple nights so that they could be consumed the next day. And the other job was really around making that food, the leftovers, safe and transportable to the fields or to the places where people were working. And that led to a very, very different solution. Not a smaller, cheaper refrigerator, but something that really just helped keep things cold and sanitary and safe to eat for 24 to 48 hours. So with that insight, we actually went back with Godrej and started from scratch. And instead of trying to figure out how to miniaturize a refrigerator, we started to figure out how do you essentially create a cooler that can keep things cool for longer than your average cooler. And what that resulted in, you see here on the screen, which is the Chotacool. So this red device that looks like it's smiling at you, but really uses technology that you see in your laptop. The fans are used to keep things cool. That it doesn't require a power source because power is so unpredictable within the rural villages of India. And a cooler, honestly, that opens from the top versus from the side like a refrigerator because it minimizes the loss of cool air that you have within the device. And so by understanding the jobs to be done that were different from the rural villages versus the cities, understanding how the circumstances were different, the need for portability, the unpredictability of electricity, we created a completely new product that really opened up a huge market. Now, interestingly, we went back, based on the jobs, we designed the product, we went back to those rural villages and we shared the prototype with them. And it led to another very interesting insight around the job to be done associated with the emotional and social jobs that are really cued by color. And so originally we had designed the Chotacool and thought it would be blue, kind of a standard appliance color when you think of the Western world. But what we found is that red is actually a color that's associated with luck and with fortune in India. And the job to be done that people had around really showing that they were fortunate, showing that they could kind of afford this little luxury, really could be solved by simply changing the color of the chotokul itself. So again, there are jobs to be done. There are layers of those. There's the functional jobs around keeping leftovers safe for the next day. There's the emotional and social jobs around showing that you care for your family and that you feel lucky and that you feel fortunate. And all of these things can be learned when you go out and actually talk to your customers. And all of those insights are really what drove to the creation of chotokul and to the large business that it is today for Godrich & Boyce.
We have a question about that. Is the chotokul story typical of when ethnographic insights come into the innovation process?
It is very typical. And what we'll talk about next in terms of how you build your jobs insights, ethnography certainly plays a huge portion of building those insights, of the work that needs to be done there, because people will do their best to tell you what they think, and you can have great conversations with them. But there's also very, very interesting things to be learned by ethnography when you see contradictions between what people do and what they say, when you see how people act in their own environment and how that may be different from what they said they do. And so ethnography is an incredibly powerful tool to understand jobs to be done really in any situation, whether you're designing something for consumers or whether you're in a B2B context.
Yeah, we had a number of questions about a B2B context.
Yeah.
Does this just apply to consumers, or can we set it in a B2B setting?
Yeah, no, I think a couple of the examples that we're sharing here are from the consumer side, just because they're easy to digest and a lot of us can relate to them personally. But the technique works equally well in a business-to-business setting. We've used it with insurance organizations, HR service companies, audit firms, etc., because the techniques that Robin will take you through in a moment around understanding the jobs to be done of the different groups that you're working with work just as well at that scale. What we have to remind people of is that just because you're B2B doesn't mean you're not dealing with individuals. So the jobs to be done are highly personal, and the best example we've shown to help people understand that is if you've had a loyal customer, and let's say you sell to chief marketing officers, and if you've had a loyal customer for 3 or 4 years, and suddenly that person retires, and you have a brand new chief marketing officer, most organizations will say, geez, we need to understand how's this guy going to tick. How are they going to buy? What are they going to think about? Are they going to do a whole overhaul of all their vendors, or are they going to keep us on board? All those anxiety moments come because you don't understand that person's personal priorities and their jobs to be done. Are they coming in to replace an outgoing leader that was seen as ineffective? So they've got to come off strong, and they've got to make an impression on their boss on how swift they're going to act, in which case, as a legacy vendor, you're in trouble simply because you're a legacy vendor. Or are they going to come in really in a caretaker mode because they're going to move on in 12 months and they were just asked to hold on to this position for a little while, in which case their priority is minimize disruptions in my life. And how can you respond to that kind of a mantra? So stepping back and saying it's not a client that we're serving as a company, it's the individuals within that company that we need to understand and develop account plans for. That's a critical insight for jobs to be done. Okay.
Great. So now that we've given you a little bit of a case study of how jobs to be done has been used in a B2C context and talked a little bit about the fact that it's also very useful in a B2B context as well, let's shift to giving you some actionable advice on how to actually go about discovering the jobs to be done. So before we do that, we want to throw another poll question at you. So think about when you meet with your customers. How do you spend your time in that conversation? Do you spend more than 75% of that time actually talking to your customer, kind of pitching them? Do you spend 50 to 75% of your time pitching to your customer? Is it more of a balance of kind of 50-50 talking and listening? Do you spend 50 to 75% of your time really listening to your customer? Or do you actually spend greater than 75% of your time listening to the customer and very little time actually talking at them? So we're going to open the poll now. So we're looking at the results, and very encouraging that very few people spend most of their time kind of monologuing at their customer. So that's great to see. Looks like about a third of people spend, balance their time between talking and really listening to their customer. About 40% of you spend a majority of the time actually listening to your customer, which is great. That's how you pull out the insights. Talking at your customer isn't going to help you learn about them. And then it's encouraging to see that about 13% of you, 15% of you, really spend the majority of your time listening to your customer when you're meeting with them. And as we talk about how to go about identifying jobs and really understanding how they can reveal opportunities for your business, you actually really want to be on the extreme end in terms of listening. You want to be 75, 85, 80% really listening. And just the times you're talking, it's always about posing questions. So it's a very different way for most people to engage with their customers, but the listening is really, really the critical part of identifying the jobs to be done. Okay. So as we think about how you actually go about identifying jobs to be done and figuring out what opportunities they could mean for you, there's really 3 steps in the process. So first, you have to actually identify who your customer is. Now, if you're in a B2C setting, so as we talked about with Goddard and Boyce, it could be as simple as who's your consumer. So who is the target consumer that you're going after? Now, you could also argue that if in a B2C setting, say, my work back when I was with P&G is, it's not really as simple as a consumer. You also have a retailer or a customer in there as well, so you need to understand your customers' jobs to be done. But in a B2C setting, most of the focus really is on the consumer for a very good reason. But things get significantly more complicated when you're in a B2B setting, because it's no longer about the consumer, the end user. It's about all those points in between. And again, as Kevin mentioned when we were going through the Q&A, when you look at a business you may be selling to, that business is filled with people. And the people are the ones making the decision. And so you need to understand the people within the businesses that are affected. So even if you look at, on this slide, medical associations, it's not just about understanding the jobs to be done of a medical association. It's about understanding the job to be done of the decision makers within the medical association. And again, that's where you see functional, social, and emotional jobs come to bear. So a quick example, we were doing some work with a medical device company, and they had typically really sought to understand surgeons and the healthcare practitioners who actually used the products they made. But they were looking to go into another part of the market, and that would bring in really selling to executives as much as the healthcare practitioners. So the situation wasn't as simple as let's just sell to hospitals. It was how do we sell, how do we understand the jobs to be done of the physician, of the surgeon, of the director of operations within the hospital, of the CEO, of the CFO, and all of the people who could affect the purchase decision. And one of the interesting things we saw is that as much as with any consumer good, emotional and social jobs came to bear in the decision making. So for example, we were talking to a CFO. You would think there would be highly functional jobs the CFO would have to do around driving profitability of the hospital, maintaining financial viability. But what we actually found is, in this case, the CFO was very, very driven by creating a legacy and establishing a reputation as a partner to the healthcare providers, even if that came at the expense of making the most financially expedient decision. And so you really have to understand all of the customers that are in your ecosystem, not just the business or the entity, but the people within that entity who affect the decisions. Step 2 is you have to decide how you're going to learn from your customers. So we've already talked about ethnographic research and the myriad of ways that that can be conducted. So we have in-home discussions with people. We've gone shopping with them. It's really about immersing yourself in the points of decision making, whether it's considering the solutions, whether it's using them, purchasing them. You want to really put yourself in the situation with your customer. And again, this can be done in a B2B setting where we've spent time observing in hospital operating rooms, in surgery prep centers, understanding what the flow is, where are the points of frustration for the nurses, for the surgeons, for the directors of operation. It's about putting yourself in that moment and understanding the points of frustration and the problems that people are trying to solve. There's also in-depth interviews, so one-on-one conversations with your customers. And a lot of times when we do this, we will allocate, an hour and a half or 2 hours, because you really have to spend time building the rapport to get to identifying the social and emotional jobs. People will initially talk about the functional jobs. They want to seem rational. They want to seem logical. And the more you get into social and emotional, if you don't have the rapport, people will hold back, and they'll tell you what they think you want to hear. Whereas if you've built the rapport and you've invested the time, you're going to hear really what the emotional drivers are. You're going to hear the irrationality, the illogical decisions. And a lot of times when we're done with these in-depth interviews, you kind of know that you've done it right, and you've got out all the good, the important and unsatisfied emotional and social jobs. When somebody at the end kind of says, oh, that felt like therapy, that's when you know you've hit the right point. Now, certainly there are other tools to use, like online surveys. We really usually only use these to confirm the results from ethnographic research or in-depth interviews, from the qualitative work we've done, where we've already identified the jobs and we want to be absolutely certain about the relative importance and satisfaction. Online surveys are a great tool for that. They are a terrible tool to identify jobs to be done. They really should only be used for confirmatory work. And if you're on a shoestring budget, go back through previous research that your company has done. You can a lot of times tease out jobs as you look at common themes across various research studies, as you look across various years of consumer insights. That can also help identify jobs to be done. There's certainly a level of interpretation that goes into that. There's, doing primary research is always better than secondary research, but again, if you're on a shoestring, much better to do the work of identifying jobs to be done, even if it's just through reviewing past research, than just kind of pursuing and going forward on your gut instinct. Step 3, once you've decided how to go talk to your customers, now you actually have to go talk to them. And as we talked about in the poll question, you really want to spend the majority of your time listening to your customers. And so what we have on this diagram is kind of a typical flow of a jobs to be done interview that we do. So first is really around setting the broad context. What is it that we're trying to learn about? Is it about how purchasing decisions are made for capital equipment at hospitals? Is it, how do you decide which brand of macaroni and cheese to buy? And then you start drilling down. What are the roles? What are the motivations? What are the circumstances that occur within this broad context? And that helps you get down to the jobs to be done. And at that point, it's kind of a long list of jobs. People are not going to pause, even though it would be easier if they would, to say, well, my job to be done in this circumstance is X. But you'll have teased them out as you go through the broad context. Once you understand those jobs to be done, we usually start talking about what are the solutions that you currently consider. What are the solutions you use? How satisfied are you with those? And so it kind of broadens the conversation back out again. Then we go through a series of questions to really identify the potential opportunities. This helps us understand the points of dissatisfaction. And then again, we broaden it out. Now that we've identified opportunities, we start talking about business models. So how do people want to receive the solution? What are the value propositions that would be interesting to them? And then again, kind of boil that down into insights around what potential solutions could be. So there was a question on the previous slide, and again, a great question, that we talked about doing primary research and in-depth interviews, and we mentioned GLG as a potential source for customers. GLG is a Garrison Lehman group, and they have an incredible database of experts in various fields. So especially if you're looking at a B2B setting or a highly specialized and focused market or industry or technology, they're a great way to find those experts and identify the people who may be more in the niches who you need to learn about a specific area of expertise. So that's who GLG is, and again, they're a great source for kind of expert interviews if you need to do those. We've listed here just some example questions that we often ask as we're doing these interviews and talking to folks. And it really is around trying to get into easy to understand conversational consumer language. So asking people about the problems, the frustrations they have. What do they like about things? What don't they like about things? What do they use? Why? What other things do they consider? And it really is about not just kind of the volley of Q&A, but about having a discussion and a true conversation. And going into those interviews with, what are the 3 to 5 things you need to learn in that interview? And then making sure you learn those 3 to 5 things, but being willing and open to follow the thread of conversation with the consumer, letting them kind of guide you through the discussion versus forcing them through a rapid Q&A exchange to try to get the specific answers to the questions you have in the specific order in which you've written them down. Now, there are certain things that you really want to listen for. So when you hear somebody say, what I'm looking for is, or I love it when, I hate it when, if only X. A lot of times if you hear the if only, that is a great insight into something that is unsatisfied. When you hear, I hate it when, the worst part is when you hear anything that signals a frustration, that is an incredibly rich area because people are already thinking about, what frustrates them, and if you can create something that resolves that frustration, that overcomes those barriers, they will eat it up. They will love it, and they will be open to it, and you have to do a lot less convincing. It also points you to areas where you want to ask why. Like, why does that frustrate you? What is it about it that you hate? What is it about it that makes that the worst thing? Again, all of those questions following up with asking why can really lead to some very, very deep insights and get you into those social and emotional jobs and get you into those aspects of solutions that are table stakes, as we say. So it has to be part of a solution to even be considered potential satisfaction for the job, or get into those elements that could really differentiate a solution and really, really nail that job in a way that other solutions aren't currently. All right. So with that, I'll toss it back over to Kevin to talk about how we use these methods of identifying jobs to be done actually in a business-to-business setting.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. So Houghton Mifflin Harcourt produces textbooks. I'm sure many of you experienced one of their publications as you moved up through your various education ranks here in the U.S. And they first of all have allowed us to talk about this story publicly, which is why we're able to disclose their information. But more importantly, they were looking at the jobs to be done as a way of transforming and responding to the introduction of technology into the classroom. And they wanted to look at it from, as we talked about before, in a B2B setting, from a multi-stakeholder environment. So we started with superintendents, we looked at principals, we talked to teachers, we went in the classroom to observe their different uses of technology. We talked to curriculum boards, we talked to parents, we talked to students. We really wanted to get a holistic view of why technology is being pulled into the classroom, why it's being resisted in some cases, and which way we think it's going to trend so that HMH could make the right call on how to invest their time and energy in pursuing this new growth opportunity. One thing we saw, for example, among superintendents was that if they were to introduce iPads, say to the local high school, they made it on the front page of the local newspaper. It was heralded as an innovative approach to education. They were seen as a very progressive thinker, and it positioned them quite well for their next job, which was a really critical priority for them because most superintendents don't last in their role more than 24 months. So they are constantly looking for the next position they can assume, and this would give them a significant story to tell during their next job interview. If they simply purchased a new round of math textbooks, that was reported on page 16 of the local newspaper, usually under the headline of school investing in legacy technology, wasting thousands of taxpayer dollars. Totally different message. Even though there might be more science and foundation for the new math book and program, it was not seen as influential or progressive as the iPads, even though there was very little titles available on the iPad to actually teach math. So the superintendent had this huge motivator on a personal and emotional level to try and position themselves as innovative. And that was what was driving a lot of the adoption. And the teachers were forced to react to this and use technology that was often subpar in the classroom or technology they weren't familiar with using. So their motivation was not feel uncomfortable or feel confident moving forward with students. Students' motivation was stay engaged with learning, keep pace with what I'm doing outside of the classroom when I'm in the classroom. So all these different conflations of jobs to be done and competing priorities were creating a whole mixture of adoption rates for technology. And what HMH had to start to do was parcel through those different areas to understand which markets do they want to enter now and how aggressively, and which ones should they let evolve a bit longer before they really understand the opportunities for them, which is a critical strategic alignment for them going forward. So this is another case of a B2B multi-stakeholder circumstance and how jobs help that strategic influence.
That's great. We are getting a lot of great questions from you in the audience, and one of them is, will we be able to download the presentation? Yes, you'll be getting a follow-up email, and you'll get the recording and also the slide deck. So we had a few questions about how you go about applying jobs to be done. Someone said, I have completed about 60 jobs to be done interviews as an analyst, but how do I prioritize which ones are going to be most profitable and which ones could lead to really launching a new growth venture?
It's a great question. So the first step you want to take is, now that you've identified the jobs to be done, and I'm sure you've heard hundreds if not thousands of jobs, you want to look for the ones that you heard the most often and go through essentially what's a qualitative assessment to say, here are the jobs that I've heard most often, here are the frustrations that I heard most often. And when you identify those most frequently occurring jobs, those are really the ones that you want to prioritize around and prioritize how you solve. The next step, and this is the process we follow, is once you've identified those important and unsatisfied jobs, the frequently occurring ones, is we do go into an ideation session. But what we use as stimuli are tools that we call customer profiles, which are really around laying out for a specific type of customer, just because it's easier for people to hold a person kind of in their mind than a big, massive group. For this person, Anna, here are her important and unsatisfied jobs, and really using that as the basis for ideation. And so when you come up with solutions to solve those important jobs for a customer, you're going to get a long list of potential solutions and ideas that come out of that ideation session. And that's really when you then pivot into testing and learning, or as we call emergent strategy, and going through multiple steps of taking concepts back out to consumers, getting their feedback on them, creating prototypes, running various assumption tests, because all of that work of testing and learning is going to help you figure out what solutions are the most profitable.
Okay. Is there a minimum number of in-depth interviews that you need to really identify those significant opportunities?
So I think there you have to look at the diversity of the audience you're looking at and the number of circumstances that you're going to want to understand. We did work with an insurance company, for example, looking at life insurance, and they only felt comfortable doing about 150 interviews because of all the different demographic segments they wanted to understand further. And when you think about the emotional and social drivers, you do get into things like, what is my ethnic background? Because that will influence my priorities and how I think about saving for my family. What is my economic circumstance? Do I have the disposable income, for example, and how does that influence my selection process? Thinking about age and my marital status and my children's status, how does that influence? So we wanted to have at least a couple of interviews in each of those different subcategories. Now, obviously, one person can fill multiple roles, but in order to feel like we had the confidence to know where the truly growth opportunities were within those areas, we had to cover that landscape. Others are comfortable with 10 interviews because you get consistent feedback from all 10, and you feel more confident to say, look, we're not learning much more here. Let's pivot into something new. Let's start to think about product testing, as our next round of discussions, because we've hit a diminishing return here on this investment.
Yeah, I would say my rule of thumb, just to echo what Kevin said, is for each different target segment, you want to do at least 10 interviews. So it's a minimum of 10 interviews. But then you also need to be open to assessing, okay, as you've gone through those 10, have you started hearing recurring themes? And then you can feel confident you've kind of got 80-20, you've got the most important and unsatisfied jobs. If you get to the end of those 10 and you're still hearing wildly different things, you need to continue on and keep talking. And it really is about continuing in the search for the common themes and the common jobs to be done.
Okay. We have a personal question from a senior product manager who says he's responsible for innovation in his company and started researching jobs to be done, but can you recommend sources like an interview guide to get a better understanding in terms of how to pose these questions to obtain insights from customers? Is there a way to do that, or is that something you just have learned over time?
So I think the sample questions we showed earlier, which will circulate with the deck, are a good starting point. And I think it's a little less about the perfect interview guide and more about the tone of the questions that you're asking. So it's not that you're doing a census or taking a survey. A lot of people will try and go into these discussions with a list of 42 questions, and they're looking for very precise answers. The benefit or the true insight comes from when the person is going off script, when they're not answering in short one-sentence answers, but rather kind of expanding on their life and their experience and their challenges. And you want to listen for those verbal cues that were also on that same slide and think about areas to probe onto, to say, oh, hey, can you just back up for a moment there? You said something that I found interesting. I haven't heard that from other people when you talked about a concern in this space. Why is that a concern for you? Has it always been a concern? Did something new change in your life that made that a concern for you going forward? Those are the facilitator skills that you need that aren't scripted into any kind of interview guide. Those questions of why, can you say more, that's interesting, can you articulate the circumstance where that occurred? Those are the kind of provocative questions that will unlock whole new levels of insight.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we train folks here to go out and facilitate these types of interviews, again, I used to create the 400 question discussion guide, and really it is about getting it down to the essence. So what is the one-page tool that we take into a discussion? What are the 3 things that we have to learn about in that discussion? And then just really relying on asking why in all of its various forms. Why? Tell me more about that. Could you explain that a little bit more? That sounds interesting. And being very, very careful to not ask what we call confirmatory questions. So those closed-ended questions of, would you like it if X? Any kind of question that can be answered with a yes, no is not the type of question you should be asking in a jobs interview.
And the only thing I would just say is practice. It's something where it's a skill that, like any other skill, gets better with time, and you'll learn additional tips and techniques as you move forward. There are moments where people will unload in an unproductive direction, and if you only have a half hour with them, you need to be able to gently bring the conversation back to those couple of critical areas you wanted to focus on. So learning how to do that tactfully and not feeling like they were closed off is a skill that only comes from practice.
Okay. So we just want to leave you with a parting thought that as you seek to really use jobs to be done to identify opportunities and really achieve impact for your company, you really don't fall in love with your solution. You need to fall in love with the problem your customers are trying to solve. Because if you fall in love with that problem, there are so many different ways that you could solve that. But if you fall in love with the solution, you can often lock into the wrong thing and not make the impact you want.
That's a great final thought, and I think it really is a good note to go out on. So thank you all for attending today's webinar on creating breakthrough customer solutions using jobs to be done. We will post the entire webinar online on our website at innosight.com, and you'll be getting an email when the recording of today's session is available to forward to colleagues. And so we recommend you contact us through innosight.com. Also, please follow us on Twitter at InnosightTeam. Kevin and Robin would also welcome hearing from you at their personal email addresses. We didn't get to everyone's questions today, but there was a lot of great conversation to be had, so we look forward to continuing it. So again, on behalf of Innosight, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.